as Chris mentioned, I'm currently the Cultural Resource Management Advisor at the Lake Superior National Marine Conservation Area, Parks Canada, and on the shores of Lake Superior. And even though tonight's title does say Great Lakes, because there's some things I had to spread out, really is it's kind of Lake Superior centric. Um, which is kind of nice for change because we're always complaining that every time we go to things, everything's always about some central and southern Ontario, and so now you're stuck listening to Northern Ontario, and I might ignore the other Great Lakes, but um, only a little bit. And yeah, and then I'm also an adjunct professor at Lakehead University as well, so kind of keeps my uh, as I like to say, keeps my feet wet, haha, pun fully intended, in the research realm. Um, yeah, and then so I'm currently living in the lovely city of Thunder Bay, which is on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, and they are a signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, uh, and the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, sorry, nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. And I'm very honored that I have the opportunity to continue to work and live and hopefully contribute to the collective knowledge of the cultural history of the area. Without further ado, so, yeah, as I just kind of mentioned, this talk is it's sort of a series. It's kind of a work in progress. So it's kind of an idea that started a couple of years ago with one of my colleagues at Parks Canada, Liam Giffen, and Liam is a really, really talented communicator. He's one of those people who can just take a lot of complex information and make it, pithy and, really great. And he's able to communicate so well. And, I kind of latched on to him as someone that I could just like verbally dump all of this info that I have in my brain and say, make it sound pretty and make it so I don't put people to sleep. And he's really good at that. Um, so as part of these sort of ongoing collaboration that we have. Oh, and he's also a huge history nerd, and he's kind of always wanted to be an archaeologist, so it works really well because he's able to nerd out with me and what I do, and I now can let somebody else sort of try and craft messaging and things like that, and without getting stressed out about it, because it's something that doesn't necessarily come easily um, for me. So had this. We ended up doing this thing called Nerd Night, which is hosted by, they're all over North America. I think actually they're all over the world, but this one is hosted by Science North, which for those of you who might be, if you've been to Sudbury, there's the big Science North Center there. It's a really cool place. They're also building a new facility in Thunder Bay, which we're really excited about. And, but anyway, they host these Nerd Nights. They host it at a brewery. It's 19 plus, so it's great. The only problem is though, is in our green uniforms, as you can see, we're wearing there. We're actually not allowed to drink, so we had to bring a change of clothes. So we presented and then changed our clothes so we could actually have a beer after. But we talked about some of the stuff we've been doing, actually train really related to train wrecks. And as we were kind of putting these things together and developing ideas, I started thinking about sort of the submerged history of transportation and industrialization within the Great Lakes. And it's kind of been sort of growing and expanding. And I started thinking it's like I should, you know, make this into like a book or maybe just a paper. We'll see. I think it might start out as a paper and then expand into a book. We're not sure yet, but that's years down the road. Um, but it's really interesting and based on a lot of this work that I've been doing in Lake Superior. And then, of course, the planes, trains, and automobiles. And I thought, okay, that's kind of a nice, like, pithy title, clever title. Not that clever, but. And then I realized as I was putting together this presentation, looking at it, I'm like, oh my God, we kind of like have physical resemblances to Steve Martin and John Candy. Whereas Liam's like very tall and thin and has, well, I have gray hair too, gray hair, and I'm kind of large and loud. So yeah, that's actually, that's even more appropriate, shall we say. So, uh, Okay. So,
I could still hear them.
yep. Are we still okay? Yeah. So one kind of a note on some of the terminology I'm going to be using here, because it gets a little challenging sometimes. Whereas, oh, and I think I'm gonna do. Oops, nope, that was the wrong one. There we go. There, that. Like wrong button. Okay. Um, so when I talk about industrial, I'm really using it as kind of a really broad catch-all term because a lot of times we're kind of looking at the uh we call it the historic record. And usually, in Ontario, we say like usually, European settlement, blah, blah, blah. Um, however, things are a little bit interesting. So, like for example, in Northern Ontario, there is sort of European excursion, but there isn't really, Europeans, there's a lot of European sort of intermixing and things coming back and forth, but there isn't really settlement the same way there is in the more southern areas. And so, but the industrialization process is still taking place. So that's kind of why I'm using sort of industrial. Uh, Also because like we know that historic, it's like, what does that really mean? And then Euro-Canadian we know is this a little bit, even though for this area is probably predominantly Euro-Canadian that settled, but when it comes to looking at sites, for example, a lot of times when we say historic sites, it's like, oh, they're Euro-Canadian. A lot of the sites here are not necessarily strictly Euro-Canadian, and I'll talk a little bit about that, why that is. And of course, this is an issue we're talking about a lot in, historic archaeology in Ontario, whereas, it's called Euro-Canadian, but then, well, is it just, are they Europeans? They could be, we have a lot of, particularly in certain areas of Southern Ontario, there's a lot of Afro-Canadians or, what about, and other people from other areas that are coming in that aren't necessarily, strictly European. So this is just an idea to talk about more of a process as opposed to, you know, um, uh, giving it us those other specific terms. One of the interesting things is that these early industries grow out of already established indigenous resource extraction practices and locations. So, a big example that comes to mind is the commercial fishery. So it's really, obviously indigenous peoples been living here for millennia. They've been, fish have been a hugely important, well, all water resources, but fishing's been hugely important. Um, when the fur trade starts, particularly Hudson's Bay Company comes in, and they start utilizing these what we would call quote unquote subsistence, and this is another word that could be problematic, fisheries to basically provide fish for all these little outposts that they had all along the North Shore. So they actually had a pretty extensive collection of these little fishing stations all over the place. And a lot of those fishing stations initially were essentially they were, where people were going to fish for, their food and maybe some trade. And then, that kind of became bigger. And then a lot of those locations eventually become the larger commercial fisheries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Um, so a lot of times there are archaeological sites here, for example, particularly ones in the late 19th, early 20th century, that it's not really clear if it's like, is it strictly commercial? Is it strictly subsistence? Sometimes they're side by side. Sometimes they're doing commercial fishing in one part of the year and then subsistence in the other. So, and it's really hard to tease that out. So it kind of makes things really, really interesting. And this is why I'm kind of talking about industrial. But even with industrial, I'm using this term like subsistence. Well, yeah, I mean, people are doing subsistence fishing and have been, but then there's also people in, the commercial industries. who are going back and doing subsistence fishing as well. So, in the same location sometimes. Um, you know, there's also this idea that it's, well, if it's industrial, it's extractive, and that they're extracting resources. Well, indigenous people have been extracting resources for a long time as well. And where do you draw that line? And then, there's the other idea. It's like, well, it's commercial. Well, you know, again, we know that there are these extensive trade networks going across the Great Lakes and across North America for, again, millennia. There's the work I've done on Lake Huron where we found obsidian in a 9,000-year-old site from Wisconsin, or from, sorry, Wyoming, in Michigan. So it got there somehow. We know, like, obviously copper, in Lake Superior. We've got Lake Superior copper that's showing up all over North America. Um, so, and while not necessarily commercial in the way that we think of it now, I mean, certainly people were gathering more than they needed to live, and were either, we're trading these. So that's commercial exchange. Um, so I guess kind of comes down to this idea of exploiting resources. So it's, really getting in and kind of not just, not just for subsistence, not just for trade, not just for a little extra, not even just for commercial, but to really like get in and exploit and really change the landscape and really change a lot of things. So that's kind of what I'm leaning towards. But again, I was going to say, I'm still sort of trying to work my way through this. Suggestions are welcome. I'm also a little rusty, as you can probably tell from, an anthropology. It's been a while since I've had to like put on the old anthropology hat. So, yeah. So these are things that kind of sort of working out. But having said that, that's kind of the fancy pants stuff. Having said that, though, as much as I said, I can't believe it's not shipwrecks because one of the things that happens is like, everybody likes to talk about the shipwrecks. Everybody's into the shipwrecks. I'm actually not that into shipwrecks. They're cool, don't get me wrong. But yeah, they can take them or leave them. Um, but they're hugely important and you can't sort of ignore them. So when we're talking about industrialization and also, transportation, we do have to start with boats because this is the OG transportation method for millennia throughout North America and very much in the Great Lakes. And just to show you this really cool. So this is a dugout canoe that has been 3D scanned. Um, there are so the Wisconsin Historical Society has been doing this dugout canoe project, and they've recently found some that have been radiocarbonated now to about, I think, 45,000 years old, which is crazy. So they're getting some really, really old dugout canoes, which is fantastic. So again, extending that record back longer and longer and longer. Um, in the Great Lakes. And then, of course, that we see as the fur trade comes in, we start seeing changes in the type of vessels that are being used. Certainly, obviously they are using canoes and, Mackinac boats and blah, blah, blah. But as we move into the industrial era where we start getting steam, and steam engines and wind power, we start seeing these big schooners. And this is just a drawing of one of the well-known shipwrecks here in Lake Superior, the Mary McLaughlin. Part of the reason it's so well known is that it's super shallow and it's like the one you can go dive. Everybody goes and does like their first open water dive on because it's there's a lot to see. It's fairly large and it's within a very couple of meters of water. And one of the things we have with the ships, though, is that as the Industrial Revolution sort of starts picking up steam, again, pun fully intended, we have the land and the sea kind of meeting each other. And I mean, this is nothing new. Harbors and docks and things have existed. Um, but we actually start to see sort of this sort of back and forth. So, for example, we see dockyards start to sort of come up that are actually moving quite a ways inland. So here's a picture of the Chacluna shipyard. which some of you may be familiar with. Kim Monk's done a lot of work on this over the past number of years. Um, Really cool site. And again, these were ships that were out in the water and then were coming to be, were being built. And a lot of these remains are now, some of them are in water, some of them aren't. Um, the other flip side is artificially manipulating water levels. Now, humans have been messing around with, water courses for, again, millennia. But we really start to see it on a much larger scale, particularly in North America. And this is some work I did back in 2000 and back in the mid 2000s. This is like early. This is baby Lisa work um, from my master's that I did in along the Rideau Canal, and this is Colonel By Lake, which is kind of the first set of locks past Kingston. And this was actually also my first sort of uh, foray into working with the underwater archaeology team at Parks Canada. So John Moore, who is now the lead, the manager of the unit, he was a pretty newly scrubbed archaeologist when I met him, and he I sort of waltzed in and I said, "Hey, you have a project for me? I want to do underwater archaeology." And he says, "As a matter of fact, I do." So we just finished doing a submerged cultural um, resources inventory of the Rideau Canal. And he said, there's some really cool stuff here, but I can't really, pursue it. I got to move on to other projects. Um, and essentially what it was is like, would we be able to map the submerged landscape and match it up with old historic maps and see if there's anything that we can see? Because when they created the canal, they flooded a lot of stuff. So in this section at Kingston Mills, um, it was the Cataraqui River, which you can still see here, right? On here, you can still see the old river channel there. Um, and this is actually, I love these historic maps because they made, it's the old, this is perfect about example of accuracy versus precision. They're incredibly precise. They're not always accurate, but they're really detailed enough that you can often match the major bends in the river bends to, the old river channel. And so what we were able to do was to match up some of these historic um, some of these items that were kind of listed in these historic maps to see if they were actually were they removed or were they just flooded over. And it turned out that looks like they were just flooded over because I believe it was, I can't remember which one of these is, oh yeah, it's number three. It was listed as a shanty, somebody's house, and they just, of course, you know, British government, they just expropriated the land and said, too bad, and flooded the area, and poor person lost his cabin or her cabin. And when we, of course, because this was all nice and geo-referenced, we were able to give those coordinates to UAT, and they were actually able to find, they couldn't really see it because the visibility here is really terrible. But when they went down in that location, they could tell there was like a big pile of like logs and debris and things like that. And they said, okay, well, kind of feels like there's some kind of pile of, rubble that probably would have been this poor person's cabin. So that was kind of cool. So again, this idea of, waterways and land and sea kind of going back and forth throughout this industrial revolution and industrialization process. Um, Again, as I mentioned about these like changing landscapes that we have. Um, so in Nipigon, one of the things they did, particularly with the railway did a lot of changing of the landscape in particularly along the North Shore of Lake Superior. Also not to mention the fact that they also, again, like a lot of things, expropriated lands from a lot of the traditional territory of the First Nations was just they were just told, do that. We're going to build a railroad here. Sucks to be you. Um, in this case, what they did was they decided that they were going to build a rail sort of trestle across the Nipigon River. So the original Nipigon River kind of, this is even before they started building the dams upstream. And they basically built this causeway across it, dammed up the river, and created this little lagoon. And so this is actually the drawing of the plan that you can see here from Library and Archives Canada. And this little lagoon is actually uh, ended up preserving, and because it was flooded, it ended up preserving a number of things from kind of the late 19th, early 20th century, because this was built in, I think, the about 1910, 1911. So all of a sudden, we have some of these older pieces that probably would have been either destroyed or maybe like flesh, like, kind of swept out, have now been actually fairly well preserved in this little lagoon, like this little skiff. There are some arguments on, is it a Mackinac or Collingwood or whatever it is. But this is like, pretty shallow water. I think what does it says 14 feet. So, 3 meters or so, right off the edge of a dock. And we were using it as programming with parks where we did this little underwater museum and we basically take out an ROV, which you could cast to a bunch of different devices, and people could actually see this little wreck in the bottom of the lagoon. So kind of makes it a little bit interesting. But again, changing these landscapes and kind of in some ways caused a lot of environmental damage in one space, in a lot of ways, but also act as a preservant in some other ways. And we'll be coming back to this lagoon again in a little bit. You'll see why. Um, of course, the rail starts becoming more and more important as part of this industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, um, the economies of these towns changed incredibly rapidly. So you end up, and there's two I'm going to talk about in particular. This is the one I'm going to talk about right now is called Jackfish. It's a pretty well-known ghost town. It gets a lot of, it's kind of a cool place. It's absolutely stunning, like gorgeous, by the way. Um, but it used to have, as you can see, like massive docks. And this is where they used to bring in coal for the rail, for the steam engines back in the day when they used to be coal. So there were these huge amount of infrastructure all along the shore, um, in Jackfish. And in the 50s, they changed from coal to diesel. And basically, the purpose of all of this infrastructure kind of ceased to exist. They didn't need to, have all of this coal getting shipped in and put into the track or to the trains and all of that. So all of this infrastructure basically was pulled down in some cases. And on top of it, this town was also initially a fishing commercial fishery. Again, also there's plenty of um, indigenous archaeological sites in like there's a series of rock structures, what are we call Pakasaw pits, even though we're not technically in Pakasaw, um, are also in this location. So people have been coming here for a very, very long time. It was a big fishery, sort of in the early late 19th century, moved into the rail, and in the 1950s, though, not only did they get the removal of the railway, they got the double whammy of the collapse of the commercial fishery in Lake Superior, well, and throughout the Great Lakes because of the introduction of sea lampreys, which decimated fish stocks. So the town basically, within about 10 to 15 years, just disappeared. There's still some remains of houses and things like that. But for the most part, the boreal forest has come back and kind of taken back the landscape, so to speak. And you can see that from, here in this picture. This is a picture, not quite looking in the same direction, looking out more this way. But you can see this is what's left of that hill, all that infrastructure, and there's a bolt in the rock. Um, and you can't see anything, but under the water, there's still remnants, and you can see it here. This is the um, uh, Nona is the non-navigation, but the Matribe. Oh, Pardon me, my cat is deciding to play with something. Of course you are. Are you done? Okay. Um, so similar, you can see it right here, even in this like very sort of low resolution bathymetry, that there's basically this out here is what you're seeing here. So that still exists today, but that's all that's left of it. Um, and you see this abandoned infrastructure. Some of it is more substantial than others. This one's a really interesting one. So similar to Jackfish is the town of Rossport. Again, commercial fishing, uh, railway, though not as important of a hub as Jackfish was. It was the railway was predominantly there to support the commercial fishery. The commercial fishery was really the big part. Um, there was all of these like there was big fishing plants and things like processing plants. Like it was a really massive area. And of course, so they built the rail infrastructure really to support getting the movement of the fish out of Rossport. And so what they did was they would load huge barrels of fish packed in ice onto these large ships, and you could see, and the rail would come up, take them off the ships, and take them on their way. So there was this, again, look at this land and sea. So this picture here was taken, we think about somewhere 1870, 1880. This picture on the right was taken somewhere around the 1950s. And you can see that all of that infrastructure is completely gone. All that's left is these little sort of little pilings kind of poking up here, and that's it. However, one of the really amazing things about the technology that we have now is we can actually see what's under the water. So this is, you see where those pilings were. This is, we took our ROV out. There's all sorts of cool stuff here. Um, and yeah, we went and we've mapped out a lot of the pilings here. You can see there's actually this is a propeller, part of a ship propeller. I mean, I'm not surprised that somebody would have lost a propeller here because it's like less than a meter's depth. You can see there's coal everywhere. And actually, it's how we were able to map out really the extent of the footprint because there's this kind of coal spread everywhere and then it just stops. And so you kind of get a sense of like, oh, that's probably where, that's probably where sort of the main industrial area ended um, at Rossport. So pretty cool stuff. Now, the other way we kind of have the rail has a relationship with the water is by going into it. And there's a couple of hot spots in Lake Superior that are kind of notorious for train derailments and they've had multiple derailments happen at specific spots. And basically what the reason there is that you've got, like this picture, you've got rock on, big cliff on one side going up, and then you've got steep drop into the lake on the other side. And there's not a lot of room for error. So if something goes wrong, you're either smashing into the rock or going into the drink. And so in this case, this is kind of this is like, I love telling this story. It's sort of a fun one. Um, the uh, so we were talking about, train derailments and things like that. And somebody had mentioned that there had been a train derailment around here and that there was a train wreckage in the water and they've been trying to find it and they couldn't find it. And we were talking about this. And when we say it publicly, we always say it's like at a local like store in town. We were at the liquor store. Of course we were. And this guy overheard us talking and he's like, oh, train wrecks. He goes, my grandfather was the station master here in Nipigon. And I have all of these photos of train wrecks. Would you like them? Holy crap. So he gave us these photos and we realized that there's this very distinct rock formation in this photo. And we literally walked out to this same curve. There's the rock formation. I mean, obviously it's weathered slightly and a little differently, but there it is. Um, and lo and behold, right across from here, there's also another picture that shows stuff in the water. And here we go. Remains of a train derailment in about 2 meters of water. Uh, And yes, those are zebra mussels. We do have them in Lake Superior in certain spots, um, which kind of sucks. But yeah, and in case you're wondering what part of the train it is, it's that part, which I discovered by reading finding. I found out what it was from a model railroad forum. Because I wasn't sure, like, I'm like, is there any way we can date this? And they said, well, it looks like this arch bar style car, which was basically used up until about the 1920s. Um, and they stopped using them because there were safety issues, though there were still like remnants kind of floating around. Which means that, this train wreck probably predates 1920, we think, which is kind of cool. And that's also important because um, one of the problems we have with doing some of this research with the train wrecks is that all of the accident reports are kind of locked down and you need to make a access to information request, which takes a really, really long time. Even as a government employee, um, I have to put in an access to information request and they can take like 6 to 8 months for these kinds of records. So I just haven't gotten around to it because it's kind of not a priority. But it is kind of hard to sort of narrow down like, oh, which accident is this? Because we don't actually, have an actual date or details. And we still do get train derailments. There was actually one that shut the highway down in 2015. But the one that actually where cars went into the lake and are still in the lake was in 2008. And there was a derailment again, cliff on one side. You can even see it here. What you don't see with that truck there is it's a very sharp curve. And you could see steep, and it actually goes down to about 20 or 30 meters, drop like straight down. Here's your cliff basically like yeah there's nowhere else for your train car to go, so this is the cleanup that was occurring. Spilled a bunch of plastic pellets all over the place. Big cleanup effort. They still wash up on the beaches to this day after almost 20 years. uh but yeah, but they left two of the cars down there because they were fairly deep, and they didn't they only had like paper material, so they figured they were reasonably safe to leave down there. So we decided, well, we want to go get some eyes on these things. Divers go, it's actually a dive, people go diving on them. And we were like, well, we got to go check this out. And I got in this big shiny, as you can see here, I'm going to show my big shiny new ROV. And you can tell I'm going to tell I was new at it because the footage sucks. But we went to go look for this. We're like, hey, this is great. We're gonna go find these train cars. We didn't find the train cars. What we found was this: a whole pile of other rubble and stuff, possibly from a completely different derailment, obviously much older. Um, yeah, no idea um, what exactly it is. There's a lot of narrow gauge rail, which was used in mining operations. Um, Cavers, where the this is located, you can see there's a little camp there. It actually was like a little a stopover, and we did find just happenstance, happened to find a newspaper article from 1916 that talked about a train derailment at Cavers, and that basically, nine cars rolled down the dump, two were partially submerged in the lake below, and they were essentially carrying kind of like this kind of material. So possibly that's our mystery wreck. But again, we can't access those records, So I mean, I can eventually, but it's kind of not on the priority list, right? Now, here's the other fun part is one of the reasons now we're moving from trains into automobiles, right? Because we're moving into the, early 20th century, and more cars are starting. And in the first sort of sections of the Trans-Canada Highway were built in the 1930s in this area. And then sort of the completion happened in about the 1960s. Um, but the, so you start seeing this shift from trains to cars. That's another reason why a lot of these communities sort of started losing, access to the rail, was because also people stopped taking the rail for travel. They started taking cars. So again, this changing, landscape, industrial landscape within the Great Lakes in general, but also within the North, really within the North Shore. And part of the reason we've actually been looking at some of these train wrecks is there's always been this rumor of, oh, there's basically every Great Lake has oh my God, there's rumor of these classic cars in a shipwreck or whatever at the bottom of the lake. And you can see here, are there really shipwrecks full of old cars at the bottom of the Great Lakes? The urban legend for Lake Superior for our area is that it was actually a train car full of Ford Model Ts that went into the lake and are still there. And of course, I'm kind of wondering, because these stories seem to be sort of consistent throughout the Great Lakes, and a couple of years ago, somebody found a Model T in the Detroit River. And actually, I just found out about this when I was at Windsor at the OAS. They were telling me about it. So that's very cool. So I'm kind of wondering if some of this is all sort of in the zeitgeist of wherever people are telling it. But we have found cars. One I found actually was one we knew was somebody had said, oh yeah, somebody had gone off the edge of a dock. I think after drinking, probably. But they just like launched off the edge of the dock. Nobody was hurt. They got out of the car. They were safe. But they were like, "Hey, can you go see if you can find the car?" And sure enough, the car was there. But this vehicle, this is a 1958 Chevy Nomad, um, and it's this is actually in that lagoon we were talking about earlier. And the reason we know it's a 1958 Chevy Nomad is sort of for fun. Um, Liam decided to put this up on our social media page and saying, "Hey, do you know what car this is?" Oh my goodness. Well, the classic car people just like went nuts and there was almost like, there were like fights, online fights about what kind of car it was. Um, but the reason that it's in the lagoon is for those of you like where I grew up in Eastern Ontario, we used to do cow chip bingo, where you'd put like money on where a cow would poop, and like a bet on a grid. Well, in Nipigon, they would put cars on the lake and then you would on the ice in the winter, and then you would bet on when the cars would sink into the lagoon when the ice would melt. And well, they did clean up a lot of the vehicles. There's still one or two kicking around there, and this is one of them. Again, kind of an interesting sort of cultural tidbit. Makes me laugh a little bit. Yeah. So again, we've gone from, we had our ships, we've gone from our trains, we go to our cars, and now we're going to planes. Now, so we're seeing this increasing industrialization and increased travel. And um, planes are really interesting, and I'm still not totally sure how they fit in, other than they seem to be very representative of at least the ones we find in the Great Lakes so far. Is really representative of sort of the military industrial complex and particularly World War II and the Cold War. So, prime example, and for those of you who might be familiar with this, this was, of course, Scarlett Janusis was very involved with this, was the recovery of the Avro Aero model from Lake Ontario in 2018, which was really, really, really cool. Um, and again, very tied in with the Cold War, and we didn't, and they destroyed the models too. They didn't just, they always talk about destroying the planes, but they also destroyed the models because they did not want anybody uh, sort of discovering our secrets, so to speak. Um, so yeah, kind of crazy. Um, and again, it really does come into this emphasis on like wartime history. And again, coming back to these ideas of these like, kind of like urban legend or urban myths. There's one we were told that there was a World War II bomber that went into the lake off one of the islands in the area. Okay, like that's yeah, very specific, of course. But there's two things that actually make this potential. One is we had manufactured aircrafts during World War II in Thunder Bay, and Elsie McGill was the queen of the hurricanes. She was a female engineer. She was one of the first ones, and she was like this totally awesome. she was amazing. Yeah. And so there was this big factory that made hurricanes and airplanes, and they apparently were making some top secret ones too. Um, and if you ever want, you know, so there's that. So those there were military craft being made in Thunder Bay. And on top of it, there was also a flight school in Thunder Bay, which is now the location actually of the Thunder Bay Airport. And one of the fun things about doing this kind of work is like I love going through archives. I love like finding little tidbits, sometimes that have nothing to do with what you're researching. But if you ever want something really, really fun, um, all of the records from all of the flight schools are digitized and available on, I believe it's the Canadiana Heritage website. So all the microfilms are all digitized. Some of them are really, really funny to read through. Like the one in Thunder Bay in particular, they were kind of like they were like a B-level school. So this is where people got trained when they were just new pilots, or if they needed like remedial training, they were sent down to Thunder Bay. And I think the guy who was like the head would get kind of bored, and his his journal entries are quite gossipy and like a little bit bitchy, and it's hilarious. So if you ever, if you're that kind of person, it's totally worth looking at. Um, Having said that, though, what's great about that is those records are all very available. There's no restrictions, and really, there are no records of any missing World War II craft having gone missing in this area. There are some in other areas, but not in Thunder Bay. There is one that might be somewhere in Lake Ontario. It's at like it was like going from the States, from Houghton to Toronto, I think, something like that anyway. But probably not here. Uh, but those records are all very, very, they're open, and they're also really, really well, they're very well documented. So probably if there's something had like crashed, there would be a record about it, we think. Anyway, but again, mentioning that sometimes you get these really, really hilarious bits when you're going through the archives, and I picked this one out. Um, So, as I mentioned, they did these, they built these airplanes, and then they would often test them at the Thunder Bay Flight School. And they were talking this is the Gregory special. Um, they made it so compact. Here's this, it got too compact. They had to have midgets to work on it to service it so it didn't sell. But actually, as far as an aerobatic and fighter aircraft, it would have been excellent except for the servicing. Where are you going to get midget pygmies to work on it? I mean, yes, I should have given you a warning. Not exactly the most, shall we say, politically correct description, but it just kind of made me laugh. Like, yeah, it's a great plane, but man, where are you going to get, like, you can't get people to work on it. It just, these are the kinds of things you come up um, in the archives that just kind of make you chuckle. So. Anyway, just a tidbit. But again, really what we're seeing when it comes to these sort of like planes and their relationships to water is usually when things go poorly. Um, and yeah, and often, like I said, focus on, really the wartime history. There have been some personal planes that have gone down in Lake Superior since, and there was, I think, a couple in the 70s and 80s that have not been located. Um, but those are again, but they're all documented. They might not have been found, but they've definitely, we know that they went down there. There's no mention of a World War II bomber actually ever having been ditched into Lake Superior. So no World War II bomber probably for me. So having gone all through this, what does it all mean? And that's a really good question. And I'm still not entirely sure I know the answers. But I think what I'm sort of trying to tease out here is these looking at these changes in transportation, from boat to train to car to plane, tells us a lot about the industrialization process. And particularly in Canada, because there was still this idea, and actually very much in Northern Ontario, this pristine wilderness, and that the land wasn't being used, right? And you still get that to a certain extent. People say it's like, oh, one could argue that it's kind of the attitudes of people who want to see the Ring of Fire, um, you know, uh, more being a fire more utilized. It's like, well, it's just land. It's just sitting there. There's nobody living there. Well, yes. So, that kind of ties into there too. Um, and these modes of transportation are interconnected with changes in landscapes, with culture and economies, and at multiple scales. So, these big things that we're seeing happen on a worldwide scale are also really affecting communities at a very local scale. And they also preserve information that isn't really visible on the terrestrial landscape, and maybe people don't even think is worth preserving because it's fairly recent history. People are like, well, why do we care that there was a trestle bridge there? Oh, it could actually tell us a lot of things about how the landscape's changed over time. Um, Especially when you get people who are like, oh, well, back in my day, like the landscape or there were, that they understood the landscape as looking a certain way. And when you kind of are able to look at some of these submerged remnants, you can understand why that landscape looks the way it does now versus what it did maybe 40, 50 years ago. And particularly in Northern Ontario, it really highlights the interconnectedness of an Indigenous and Euro-Canadian peoples throughout the process of industrialization. There is, a number like Indigenous people just didn't, stay and do their subsistence fishery. Again, that's probably, that's not really accurate, but they were involved in that industrialization process. They became commercial fishermen. They became commercial loggers. They worked in mines. They worked on the railroads, and they still do. So there's this idea that it's kind of this dichotomy, and it's not, it's really interconnected. And so I'm kind of trying to tease out all these little threads to try and tell the story of, I guess, really the interconnectedness of people and landscape and transportation through the lens of underwater archaeology. Oh. And on that note, thank you. And does anybody have any questions?